2 years had passed since the day Jonathan walked into Emily's apartment, flowers in hand and a heart full of regret. So much had changed since then. Their lives were no longer defined by missed opportunities or lingering doubts, but by the laughter of their daughter, Lily, who was now a spirited toddler with her mother's bright eyes and her father's curious mind. The three of them had grown closer with each passing month, learning to navigate the ups and downs of life as a family. One crisp autumn evening, Jonathan stood outside a quiet garden venue, watching workers arrange chairs beneath an arch adorned with wildflowers. It wasn't the grand, extravagant affair his previous wedding had been. There were no crystal chandeliers or endless guest lists this time. Instead, it was simple and intimate, just the way Emily had always wanted. Friends and family mingled nearby, chatting excitedly as golden sunlight filtered through the trees. Jonathan adjusted his tie nervously, glancing at Mark, who stood beside him as best man. "You ready for this?" Mark asked with a grin. "I've been ready for 2 years," Jonathan replied, smiling back. His voice carried a mix of excitement and relief. This moment felt like the culmination of everything he'd worked toward. A chance to start fresh, not out of obligation or guilt, but because he truly loved Emily. As the music began to play, all heads turned toward the entrance. There she was, walking down the aisle in a flowing white dress that shimmered softly in the fading light. Her hair was loose, framing her face in gentle waves, and her bouquet was a mix of daisies and baby's breath. Simple yet beautiful, just like her. Beside her, little Lily toddled along, clutching a basket of flower petals, giggling as she scattered them unevenly on the ground. When Emily reached Jonathan, she smiled up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, wordlessly acknowledging how far they'd come. The officiant began speaking, but Jonathan barely heard the words. All he could focus on was Emily, the woman who had taught him the true meaning of love, forgiveness, and second chances. During their vows, Jonathan spoke from the heart, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Emily, I spent so many years chasing success, thinking it would make me happy. But standing here with you today, I realize that happiness has nothing to do with money or status. It's about finding someone who believes in you, challenges you, and loves you even when you don't deserve it. That's what you've given me, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt how much you mean to me." Emily's cheeks flushed pink as she wiped away a tear. When it was her turn, her voice trembled slightly, but her words were clear and heartfelt. "Jonathan, when I first saw you again at your wedding, I didn't think we could ever find our way back to each other. But you proved me wrong. You showed me that people can change, that love can heal even the deepest wounds. Today, I'm not just marrying the man I fell in love with once. I'm marrying the man you've become, and I couldn't be prouder to call you my husband." By the time they exchanged rings and sealed their vows with a kiss, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Even Lily clapped enthusiastically, earning chuckles from everyone around. Later that night, as the stars twinkled above and guests danced under strings of fairy lights, Jonathan pulled Emily close for a slow dance. Lily sat nearby, playing contentedly with her cousins, her laughter ringing through the air. "You know," Jonathan whispered, resting his forehead against Emily's, "I used to think success was the most important thing in life. But now I know. It's moments like this. Being here with you and Lily, knowing we're building something real together. That's what matters." Emily smiled, leaning into him. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "We have," he agreed, "and I wouldn't trade it for anything." As they swayed beneath the starlit sky, surrounded by the people they loved most, Jonathan felt a deep sense of peace. He had finally found what he'd been searching for all along, not wealth or status, but a home filled with love, trust, and purpose. And for the first time in his life, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The weeks that followed were anything but easy. Jonathan threw himself into proving to Emily that he had changed, that the man standing before her now was different from the one who had walked away years ago. He started small, showing up every day after work to help with whatever she needed. Whether it was carrying groceries, fixing a leaky faucet, or simply sitting quietly while she studied for her teaching exams, he made sure she knew he was there. At first, Emily kept him at arm's length. She appreciated his efforts, but trust wasn't something she could hand over so easily. "You can't just waltz back into my life and expect everything to be okay," she told him one evening as they sat in her modest living room. Her voice was firm, but not unkind. "It's going to take more than flowers and apologies to fix what you broke." Jonathan nodded, understanding where she was coming from. "I know I don't deserve your trust, not yet, anyway, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn it. You and our baby are the most important things in my life now." His sincerity began to chip away at the walls she'd built around herself. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their interactions grew warmer. They talked about everything: their past mistakes, their hopes for the future, and even the fears they both carried. Jonathan learned that Emily had dreamed of becoming a teacher since she was a child, but financial struggles had forced her to put those dreams on hold. Determined to support her, he offered to pay for her tuition and cover her expenses while she finished school. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked cautiously when he brought it up. "I don't want you thinking I'll owe you anything." "It's not about owing me," Jonathan replied gently. "It's about giving you the chance to chase your dreams without worrying about money. That's all I want, for you to be happy." Over time, Emily began to see glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with years ago. The man who used to stay up late helping her study, who laughed at her terrible jokes, and who promised to build a life full of purpose and joy. This new version of Jonathan was still ambitious, but his priorities had shifted. Instead of chasing wealth for its own sake, he focused on creating stability and happiness for their growing family. Their daughter, Lily, arrived earlier than expected, bringing chaos and beauty into their lives. During those early days, Jonathan stayed by Emily's side, learning how to change diapers, rock Lily to sleep, and navigate the endless challenges of parenthood. Watching him cradle their tiny baby in his arms, Emily felt a spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Still, rebuilding their relationship wasn't without its hurdles. Old wounds didn't heal overnight, and there were moments when doubt crept back in. One evening, as they sat together on the couch while Lily slept peacefully in her bassinet, Emily turned to Jonathan with a serious expression. "I need to know something," she said softly. "Are you doing all this because you feel guilty, or because you genuinely want us together?" Jonathan met her gaze, his heart swelling with emotion. "Emily, I won't lie. I carry a lot of guilt for how I treated you, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I love you. Because seeing you smile makes me happier than any business deal or fancy car ever could. And because I want to wake up every morning knowing that we're building a life together, for real this time." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that Jonathan truly meant what he said. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't always be easy, but they were taking steps towards something real, something worth fighting for. As the months passed, their bond deepened. Jonathan continued to prove himself through actions rather than words, showing up consistently and supporting Emily in ways big and small. Together, they navigated the joys and challenges of parenthood, rediscovering the love that had once brought them together. By the time Lily took her first steps, Jonathan and Emily had taken their own tentative steps toward forgiveness, healing, and a second chance at happiness. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Jonathan's penthouse as he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. Today was the day he'd been dreading and anticipating for weeks. Telling Victoria the truth, he had rehearsed the conversation countless times in his head, but no matter how he phrased it, the words sounded hollow and inadequate. How could he possibly explain to her that their engagement was built on a foundation of lies? That his heart belonged to someone else. When he arrived at Victoria's family estate, She greeted him with a warm smile, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. She looked radiant as always, dressed impeccably in a tailored blouse and skirt. "You're early," she teased lightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I was just about to call you." Jonathan forced a smile, though his hands trembled slightly as he held onto the bouquet of roses he'd brought. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice unsteady. The playful glint in her eyes faded instantly, replaced by concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked, tilting her head. Her tone was calm, but Jonathan could see the flicker of unease behind her composed exterior. I don't know where to start," he admitted, sinking into one of the plush chairs in her living room. Victoria sat across from him, her expression now guarded. "There's something I need to tell you, something important." Victoria folded her hands neatly in her lap, her posture stiffening. "Go on," she said quietly, bracing herself. Taking a deep breath, Jonathan began. He told her about Emily, how they had been together in college, how they broke up because of his ambition, and how he saw her again at the wedding reception. He explained about the baby, his child, and the whirlwind of emotions that followed. With each word, Victoria's face grew paler, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the armrests of her chair. "So let me get this straight," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You're telling me that not only did you run into your ex-girlfriend at our wedding, but she's also pregnant with your baby?" Jonathan nodded, guilt washing over him. "I'm so sorry, Victoria. I never meant for any of this to happen. You deserve better than this, a man who can give you his whole heart. But right now my heart is torn between you and them." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, to Jonathan's surprise, Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "You know, I always knew there was something missing between us," she confessed, her voice tinged with sadness. "But I convinced myself it didn't matter, that we could build a good life together anyway. Turns out, I was wrong." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, refusing to let him see her cry. "I won't stand in your way, Jonathan. If Emily and that baby are what you truly want, then go to them. But don't expect me to wait around while you figure things out." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time, Jonathan realized just how unfair he'd been, not just to Emily, but to Victoria as well. She deserved honesty, respect, and love without conditions, and he couldn't give her that anymore. As he left the estate later that afternoon, Jonathan felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Breaking off the engagement was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but it was also the most honest. Now he could focus on rebuilding the bridges he'd burned, starting with Emily. That evening, he returned to her apartment, flowers in hand and determination in his heart. When she opened the door, her expression softened slightly at the sight of him. "What do you want, Jonathan?" she asked wearily. "I want to make things right," he replied earnestly. "For you, for the baby, and for us, if you'll let me." Emily hesitated, searching his face for sincerity. Finally, she stepped aside, letting him in. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a beginning. Back in his penthouse apartment, Jonathan paced the length of his living room, his mind racing with everything Emily had said. Her words replayed over and over in his head like a broken record. Asterisk, "You disappeared from my life. I worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Don't expect me to forgive you just because you showed up." Asterisk. Each sentence felt like a punch to the gut, forcing him to confront the reality of how much he'd hurt her and how blind he'd been to her struggles. He thought about the baby, too, his child. The idea filled him with a mix of emotions: excitement, fear, and overwhelming guilt. How could he have gone all this time without knowing? And what kind of father would he be now, stepping into the picture so late? He wanted to do right by them both, but he wasn't sure where to start. Could Emily ever trust him again after everything that had happened? The weight of his choices crashed down on him, not just the decisions he'd made years ago, when he let ambition take priority over love, but also the ones looming ahead. In less than a week, he was supposed to marry Victoria. She represented everything society expected of him: beauty, elegance, and a perfect partnership built on shared social circles and mutual benefit. But as Jonathan sat down on the edge of his couch, staring at the engagement ring on his finger, he realized something unsettling. He didn't feel the same spark with Victoria that he once felt with Emily. There was no fire, no depth, no connection that went beyond surface-level charm. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Mark, his best friend since college, calling to check in. "Hey man," Mark said cheerfully. "How's married life treating you?" Jonathan hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure I can go through with it," he admitted finally, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "Something's come up." Mark listened intently as Jonathan poured out his heart about seeing Emily at the wedding, learning about the baby, and the whirlwind of emotions that followed. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You've got a decision to make," Mark said carefully. "But here's the thing, John. You can't keep running away from your past. If you care about Emily and that baby, you owe it to them, and to yourself, to figure things out. Life's too short to live with regrets." Jonathan knew Mark was right, but the path forward wasn't clear. He cared deeply for Emily, and the thought of being part of his child's life filled him with hope. Yet breaking off the wedding would mean letting go of the future everyone expected of him, and potentially hurting Victoria in the process. Could he really throw away years of planning and sacrifice for a second chance with someone who might never forgive him? That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned, haunted by memories of Emily's tired eyes and the way she'd looked at him earlier, equal parts anger and sadness. He wondered if she still carried any feelings for him, or if their bond was irreparably broken. Either way, he owed it to her, and to himself, to try. Meanwhile, Emily lay awake in her own bed, staring at the ceiling. Seeing Jonathan again had stirred up emotions she thought she'd buried long ago. Part of her wanted to believe he had changed, that he genuinely cared about her and their unborn child. But another part, a louder, more cautious part, reminded her of the pain he'd caused. Trusting him again wouldn't be easy, especially when her instincts screamed that people rarely changed as much as they claimed. As dawn broke over the city, neither of them had reached a resolution. But one thing was certain: the days ahead would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. For Jonathan, it meant facing the consequences of his actions and deciding what truly mattered most. For Emily, it meant deciding whether to open her heart again or protect herself and her child from further heartbreak. Whatever happened next, their lives were intertwined now, bound together by a tiny life growing inside her. Jonathan stood outside Emily's apartment door, his heart pounding like a drum. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was the right thing to do. What if she slammed the door in his face? What if she didn't want anything to do with him? The thought made his stomach churn, but he knew he couldn't leave without trying. Summoning every ounce of courage, he knocked firmly on the door. For what felt like an eternity, there was no response. Just as he began to think she wasn't home, the sound of footsteps echoed from inside. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open just wide enough for Emily to peek through. When she saw Jonathan standing there, her eyes widened in shock. For a split second, neither of them said a word. Then her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp and guarded. She clutched the edge of the door tightly, as though ready to shut it at any moment. I needed to talk to you," Jonathan stammered, suddenly unsure of himself. "After last night, I saw you at the wedding. You're pregnant. Is it mine?" Emily sighed deeply, leaning against the doorframe. Her defensive posture softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "Of course it's yours, Jonathan. Who else's would it be?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had suspected it, but hearing her confirm it sent a wave of guilt crashing over him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. I had a right to know. Emily crossed her arms over her chest, her lips pressing into a thin line. A right to know. Really? After everything that happened between us, you think I owed you that? You disappeared from my life, Jonathan. You chased your dreams and left me behind. Do you have any idea how hard it was for me after we broke up? Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off before he could speak. I worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet while you were busy building your empire. I didn't contact you because I didn't want to burden you or beg for scraps of attention. I wanted to stand on my own, even if it meant struggling. Her words hung heavy in the air, each one landing like a blow. Jonathan felt the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. He had been so focused on success that he hadn't stopped to consider the cost, to Emily or to himself. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I never meant to hurt you. I was selfish, and I let ambition blind me. But I'm here now. Please, can we talk about this? About the baby. About us. Emily studied him carefully, searching his face for sincerity. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, reluctantly, she stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. Fine, she said quietly, but don't expect me to forgive you just because you showed up. As Jonathan entered the small, cozy apartment, he noticed the little details that spoke volumes about her life. A stack of textbooks on the coffee table, a pair of tiny baby booties hanging from a hook near the kitchen, and a framed photo of them together from college sitting on a shelf. It was clear she hadn't forgotten their past entirely. They sat down across from each other, the tension thick between them. This was only the beginning of what promised to be a difficult conversation, but Jonathan knew it was a step toward making things right. That night, as the mansion emptied and the last of the wedding decorations were packed away, Jonathan found himself sitting alone in his study. The room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the air conditioner doing little to drown out the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He stared at the half-empty glass of scotch on his desk, but he barely touched it. His thoughts kept returning to Emily, her face, her smile, her unmistakable presence at his wedding. Memories came flooding back, unbidden and vivid. He remembered their college days, when life felt so simple and full of promise. Emily had been his anchor during those years, always encouraging him, always believing in him even when he doubted himself. She would sit with him late into the night, helping him prepare for exams or brainstorm ideas for his first business venture. They dreamed together about buying a cozy house, traveling the world, starting a family. But somewhere along the way, those dreams slipped through their fingers. Jonathan recalled the arguments that began to creep into their relationship after graduation. He had landed an entry-level job at a tech startup, determined to prove himself. Long hours turned into all-nighters, and weekends became workdays. Emily tried to understand at first, but eventually, her patience wore thin. You're chasing success like it's the only thing that matters, she'd said one evening, her voice trembling with frustration. But what about us? He hadn't known how to respond then, and he still didn't have an answer now. All he knew was that he had let her go because he thought he could replace her love with achievements, wealth, and recognition. And maybe for a while, he convinced himself that he had succeeded. But seeing her again tonight, pregnant and working as a waitress at his wedding, made it painfully clear that no amount of money or status could ever fill the void she left behind. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became, not at Emily, but at himself. How could he not have seen how much he hurt her? Why hadn't she reached out to tell him about the baby? Or maybe she had tried, and he had been too busy to notice. Either way, the guilt was overwhelming. He owed her answers, and he owed them to himself. Determined to confront her, Jonathan decided to track her down. He started by calling the catering company that had handled the wedding reception. After some persuasion, and perhaps a generous donation to their operations fund, he managed to get the name of the agency that employed Emily. By early morning, he had her address scribbled on a piece of paper. As he drove to her apartment building the next day, Jonathan rehearsed what he would say. Should he apologize? Ask about the baby? Demand to know why she never contacted him? Each scenario played out differently in his head, but none of them felt right. What if she refused to see him? What if she hated him? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he pushed forward, knowing he couldn't turn back now. When he finally arrived at her modest apartment complex, his hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever happened next, he knew it would change everything. For better or worse, Jonathan was ready to face the past he had tried so hard to leave behind. The ceremony went off without a hitch, and soon the lavish reception was in full swing. Guests were laughing, clinking glasses, and dancing under the sparkling lights. Jonathan did his best to play the role of the happy groom, shaking hands, posing for photos, and making polite small talk. But despite the cheerful atmosphere, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been nagging at him since earlier that day. As he stood near the dessert table, absently swirling a glass of champagne, something, or rather, someone, caught his eye. Across the room, a waitress moved gracefully between tables, balancing a tray of appetizers with practiced ease. At first glance, she blended into the background like any other staff member, but there was something oddly familiar about her. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the faint curve of her smile as she thanked a guest. It stirred something deep within him. Jonathan's breath hitched as recognition dawned on him. It was Emily. His Emily. Or at least, the woman who used to be his. She looked different now, dressed in a simple black uniform instead of the sundresses he remembered. Her face was more mature, her features softened by time, but it was unmistakably her. And then he noticed something else. Her belly. She was pregnant. For a moment, Jonathan felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with questions. Why was she here? How could she be working as a waitress at his wedding? Was the baby his? He wanted to march over and demand answers, but before he could act, their eyes met across the crowded room. Emily froze, her expression flickering with surprise, then panic. For just a second, their gazes locked, and Jonathan saw a mix of emotions flash in her eyes: shock, sadness, maybe even anger. Then, without a word, she turned away, busying herself with refilling drinks and avoiding further eye contact. Jonathan stood rooted to the spot, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Jonathan tried to focus on the festivities, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Emily. Every time he spotted her moving quietly through the crowd, he felt a pang of guilt and regret. He replayed memories of their past together in his mind. The laughter, the late-night conversations, the dreams they once shared. How had things gone so wrong between them? And what was she doing here, serving food at the celebration of his new life? When Victoria pulled him onto the dance floor for their first dance as a married couple, Jonathan went through the motions mechanically. His body swayed to the music, but his mind was miles away. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily, her tired eyes, her swollen belly, the way she looked at him before quickly looking away. Something about her presence felt deliberate, almost like fate intervening to remind him of the life he'd left behind. By the end of the night, Jonathan knew he couldn't let this go. Whatever brought Emily to his wedding, whatever secret she carried, he needed answers. As the last guests trickled out and the band packed up their instruments, Jonathan made up his mind. Tomorrow, he would find her. He didn't know what he would say or how she would react, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The room buzzed with excitement as Jonathan Hartley stood at the center of it all, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit. His sharp jawline and confident posture made him look every bit the successful man he had become. The grand hall shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors. White roses cascaded down elegant arches, filling the air with a soft, sweet fragrance. Hundreds of guests mingled around, sipping champagne and exchanging compliments about how perfect everything was. Jonathan glanced around the room, taking in the scene. This was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, his wedding to Victoria Sterling, a woman who seemed to embody grace and sophistication. She was stunning in her ivory gown, her golden hair styled into an intricate updo. Everyone said they were the perfect couple, handsome, wealthy, and admired by all. But as Jonathan stood there, waiting for the ceremony to begin, something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was missing. It wasn't Victoria's fault. She was everything society expected of a bride. Polished, poised, and perfectly charming. Yet deep inside, Jonathan knew this wasn't the kind of love he had once dreamed of. There was a time when his heart belonged to someone else entirely, Emily Carter. Emily had been his first love, the girl who stayed up late helping him study, laughed at his terrible jokes, and believed in him when no one else did. They met during their freshman year of college, two kids chasing big dreams. Back then, Jonathan was just another student scraping by on scholarships, while Emily worked part-time jobs to pay her tuition. Together, they promised each other they'd build a future filled with happiness and purpose. But life had other plans. As Jonathan climbed the corporate ladder, his priorities shifted. Late nights turned into missed dates, promises went unfulfilled, and eventually Emily walked away. Their breakup left a scar on his heart, though he tried hard to bury those memories beneath layers of success. He told himself moving on was the right thing to do. He convinced himself that wealth and status would fill the void she left behind. Now, here he was, standing on the brink of marrying someone new, yet the weight of unfinished business lingered in the corners of his mind. What if he had fought harder for Emily? Would things have been different? These thoughts swirled in his head as the music began playing, signaling the start of the ceremony. Guests took their seats, and Victoria appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant and smiling. For a moment, Jonathan forced himself to focus. This was his future now, a life of luxury, stability, and admiration. Or so he thought. Little did he know, fate had one last surprise waiting for him. Hidden among the waitstaff serving hors d'oeuvres and refilling glasses, a face from his past, unexpected and unforgettable, was about to turn his world upside down.